Nestled within the rural landscape of Elbert County in Colorado lies a small, seemingly ordinary town called Katy. This town, with its very closely knit community, appeared to be the kind of typical rural haven where people lived a peaceful life. Yet hidden in the deep outskirts of this small town and north of Colorado Springs is a ranch that would become the epicenter of a series of bizarre events and reports. Clearview Ranch was first known as the Mulligan Homestead. The parcel of land was first acquired in 1896 and the Mulligan family bought it in 1907, where they first built the ranch. The actual, specific location of the ranch has never been disclosed, presumably due to privacy concerns and such. However, by the way of this map, drawn up by Katy Page, who states that she used to stay at the ranch during her youth, we can deduce that it's in this general area here. The Mulligan family stayed at this ranch for 38 years and they sold it in 1945. There's not a lot known about the Mulligan family other than Dick, or Richard Mulligan, who was born at the ranch. In an article produced back then, we have this quote: "The history of Winter Park is filled with the names of men and women whose contributions made Winter Park a special place. One such person was Dick Mulligan. Dick became Winter Park ski area's caretaker in 1945, a friendly, outgoing Irishman from Katy, Colorado. Dick had a well-known love for conversation and an excellent gift of bold exaggeration. This trail in reality is only half a mile long and is in tribute to Dick and his gift of exaggeration. This is actually a fascinating piece of information because there have been many reports of incredibly strange things happening at this ranch over the years. And while we cannot say for certain that Dick ever reported anything, the fact that people believed he liked to exaggerate things may imply that he could have also said some unusual things about the ranch, and people thought he just wasn't being serious. Of course, we don't know that for sure, and outside of Dick and his position at the Winter Park, not much is known about the Mulligans and their experiences, or perhaps lack thereof at the ranch. Now, as said, they sold the property in 1945, but between then and 1965, there's no real information to share other than for around 10 of those years, the property sat vacant. In 1965, the Baker family purchased the ranch where it became known as the Old Baker Ranch, and they stayed there for a number of years before once again leaving it abandoned, and then it was sold on in 1975. In October of 1975, the Priestley family, comprised of John and Barbara and their two sons, Joe and Miles, made the bold decision to move to this 60-acre property in eastern Colorado. This decision was not made lightly. John, a former military man with a disciplined and methodical approach to life, had spent months meticulously researching properties, ensuring that the one they chose would be perfect for his family's new start. The property they settled on happened to be this very ranch, located about 30 miles east of the Rocky Mountains, a region renowned for its breathtaking vistas and serene landscapes. This was exactly the kind of place that John wanted for his family, away from the chaos of urban life. As mentioned, the property had been left abandoned twice for a number of years before the Priestleys moved in, and with this abandonment came local whispers and rumours of strange happenings at the site. Stories floated around about an entire building that had stood on the property a decade before had vanished without a trace and no one had seen it be demolished. Locals spoke of strange lights, eerie noises, and an overwhelming sense of dread that seemed to permeate throughout the area. John, though, being the pragmatist that he was, dismissed the stories as superstitious nonsense and was just excited to get himself and his family moved in. It wasn't just the Priestleys who moved in though. Jim Tarr was an old acquaintance of John's and a business partner. Together with Jim, they pooled their resources and bought the ranch. We know this because in 1978, Jim and the Priestley family had reported experiencing a string of unusual events and asked two PhDs to conduct a report on the ranch. This team consisted of Dr. John S. Durr, a consultant in seismology, and Dr. R. Leo Sprinkle, a consultant in psychology. It is in their report that we find the finer details. John and Jim's plan was to renovate the site and establish it as hopefully a profitable working cattle ranch. For one reason or another, Jim wanted to carve out a new life for himself and saw this as the perfect opportunity. They cited that they loved the size and features of the ranch and loved the fact that they had springs which fed into a pond right near the ranch house. The ranch house was home to the family, while Jim set up his own accommodation close to the main property. Katy Page, who I mentioned earlier, has been quite vocal about the ranch and the weirdness that has taken place there. Because everyone involved at the ranch wanted to keep their privacy, the timeline remains somewhat confused and unclear. But the best I can piece together is that Katy did not move in exactly when the Priestleys did. But in 1973, Katy's mother and father had been through a divorce, and this paved the way for Katy's mother to meet John, who may have been separated from Barbara at some point. So, from late 1975 to 1978, Katy and her sister, Chris, lived in Englewood to make schooling easier. But over the weekend, from Friday through to Sunday, they stayed over at the ranch. And they too claim to have experienced bizarre things along with the rest of those present. Though, to add a layer of confusion, it's not clear when or if Barbara left the property, as she is referenced throughout the 1978 report by Dr. John S. Dare and Dr. R. Leo Sprinkle. So it could be that Katy's mother may have been dating Jim instead and not John. Katy, her sister and mother also don't seem to be mentioned in the report at all, and I'm not sure if this is down to privacy concerns or something of that effect by Katy's mum at the time. That confusion aside, right from the get-go of moving in, the Priestley family threw themselves into the work of setting up their new home. They cleared out old overgrown areas and spent a lot of time making the house and outbuildings livable again. Joe and Miles spent their days exploring the woods and helping John and Jim with whatever work was going on. The family's dream of a peaceful existence, though, would not last. According to John, the strange occurrences that had been whispered about in the town began to present themselves at the property. What had started as a hopeful fresh chapter in their lives was about to change. To set the scene, for whatever reason, the winter of 1975 was particularly harsh, with the cold biting down hard and the snow piling up high around the ranch. On the 23rd of November, in the early hours of the morning, the entire family stated that they had been awakened by a large vibration that permeated the house. John stated that the walls of the ranch house were vibrating and there was a low-pitched noise present, described as sounding something like a generator pulsating. He tried to figure out what was going on and rushed outside, but said that there was nothing to indicate that it was emanating from the outside. So instead, he rushed to the fuse box and turned off all the power to the house. But this vibration and sound continued anyway. In total confusion, he then went back outside again and could still not determine what was happening or where the source of this noise was coming from. He then realised that it was as if this odd persistent hum was coming from the ground beneath their feet. Both John and Jim had a hard time describing this sensation, but ultimately said that it was like a low-frequency vibration with a deep thrumming sound that resonated through the very bones of the house. This hum would come and go at random times, sometimes appearing in the early morning and sometimes late at night, but always unpredictable and accompanied by a very unsettling feeling. At first, John dismissed the hum as a mechanical issue. Despite shutting down the power to the house a number of times, he still assumed that it must be coming from the electrical wiring or the gas mains, perhaps a loose pipe or a malfunctioning piece of equipment. So with that in mind, he hired several professionals to check both the electrics and the gas, and he was essentially told that his property was safe and they couldn't find a problem. It's not clear how much John had told them about what was happening, though based from the reports, the fact that the family members' names, including the surname, are just aliases, it appears that he was worried about the way people would think of the family. So, I'd assume he likely wasn't completely forthcoming with the electricians and gas specialists. Further evidence of this comes from the testimony of Chris. She said, "My memories, focused around the ranch and the very unusual stuff that was reportedly happening there, have been neatly tucked away for years. The adults in the situation made it clear that I was not to talk to anyone about what I saw or what I overheard. Not that I probably would anyway, for fear that my friends would think I was a liar. As far as I could tell, along with all the others in the house, we were in constant fear, but kind of just trying to get on with daily life. Sort of like pretending, nothing to see here, everything is normal. I honestly felt like we had this massive, weighty secret thrust upon us that we couldn't tell anybody about. The adult she's referring to, I can only assume, must have been her mother, John, Jim, and potentially Barbara. Now, the vibrations, while perhaps not the case at first, these vibrations and hums would start to be accompanied by what was described as metallic grinding or clanging sounds, similar to what you might expect from machinery. This reminds me of something similar reported at Skinwalker Ranch. In 1911, settlers in the vicinity of the future Skinwalker Ranch site reported hearing sounds of a similar vein to those described by the Priestleys. The settlers reported hearing large, distant, echoing bangs that resembled thunder and metal strikes. Later on, these sounds were thought to be as a result of layers of rock crashing against one another along the fault line present there. Future owners of the ranch, the Sherman family, claimed to have heard what sounded to them like heavy machinery operating beneath the ground, which is an interesting side point. All members of the Priestley family had similar things to say about it, that it was relatively quiet usually, but had a way of getting under their skin and made them feel agitated, uneasy, and on edge. It was a constant, nagging presence that they could never quite escape. The noise would disrupt sleep, sometimes growing louder, which is when the house itself would start to shake or vibrate. November 23rd wasn't the first time the family heard the humming and felt the vibrations. Weeks before then, they had heard it for the first time, very briefly. While that had happened, Joe, the eldest son, was with a friend of his from Kiowa on the property. They were rabbit hunting and trudging through the deep snow surrounding the property. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting low shadows across the landscape, and everything was quiet, apart from the snow crunching beneath their boots. It was in this stillness that they stumbled upon an incredibly unusual sight. Instead of finding a rabbit, they came across a buffalo carcass in one of the ranch's pastures. From their own testimony, they approached the carcass and saw that its neck was twisted to such a degree that the buffalo's horns were embedded in its own shoulders. Joe and his friend didn't stick around, instead sprinting back to the homestead to tell his father. John and Jim, armed, left the home to find it and couldn't quite make sense of what they were seeing. They stated that there were no prints in the snow leading to the buffalo aside from the ones by Joe and his friend, and now themselves. They went on and said there were no obvious signs of a struggle in the snow or on the ground either, though it was just obvious that a seemingly tremendous amount of strength had been applied in whatever had happened. They tried to come up with ways in which this might have happened, but noted that the carcass was just laying in a snow-covered open field, far away from fences or structures. They also couldn't come up with a coherent explanation while trying to reason that the buffalo may have been travelling at speed and somehow tripped over itself. To them, it just appeared that the force applied was so strong that they couldn't believe it happened that way. After failing to come up with a logical explanation, they called the sheriff's office and a local veterinarian who arrived at the scene one after the other. The vet arrived first and was a young man who had recently graduated from university. Very much like John and Jim, he speculated that the buffalo may have been running at full speed, perhaps tripped and somersaulted, causing its head to hit the ground first and then resulting in the outcome before them. However, he also said that he was doubtful of this, but it was the only thing that he could really come up with, and seemed to agree that there would have been evidence of this in the snow. Although I suppose that could have happened at an earlier date, nobody noticed, and then further snow just layered on top, clearing the scene of such evidence. Though I'd imagine those present would have considered that and must have felt that wasn't the case based on what they'd said at least. The sheriff questioned if a bear could have been responsible for this mess. The vet stated that theoretically a bear might be strong enough to injure a buffalo in such a tremendous way, but he was told that the bears don't usually stray this far east of the Rockies. This is when Joe joined the group and said something that he hadn't previously told John and Jim. He blurted out that he and his friend thought they may have seen something else in the tree line. The description he gave was that they only saw it very briefly before it left their view, but he said that it looked like an enormous man, though he could only really see a black silhouette from the distance. It seems that this comment was brushed off though, and not taken too seriously, as nothing more was said about it. There's a lot to go over, so I won't bring up the cattle again, but it is important to note that finding the carcasses of these buffalo was fairly frequent throughout their time at the ranch. In almost every find that they made, the Priestleys didn't know what had happened. This was not the only occasion that a black, shadowy figure would be reported on the ranch. One evening, the adults had gone to a conference in Denver, leaving behind Joe and Miles on the ranch. They had been playing in some of the thickets outside when, according to the boys, they heard a loud roar coming from the tree line. Joe had a very similar description to what he'd previously told everyone. This time, the boys said that they were able to see its eyes reflecting the light, but otherwise it was a towering silhouette of a figure standing upright that he thought was covered in fur or was wearing something with a lot of fur. The pair of them freaked out and were convinced that it was moving towards them, so they ran back towards the ranch house, slammed the door and locked it. Although they couldn't see anything outside, they believed it had approached the house and thought they could hear footsteps and the scratching of the walls outside. They recalled huddling together in fear upstairs, just waiting for John and Jim to return. Not long after that incident, during one of the weekends, Katy was staying over with her sister. The girls, with the boys, had been playing video games and hanging out together, and they all went to bed a bit later than usual. It's not clear what time it was, but after having fallen asleep, Katy woke up. In the corner of the room, she said, was what she thought was a shadow. She didn't realise what was casting it, but then it moved and filled her with an overwhelming sense of dread. She said that she felt paralysed, like she could no longer move her own body. She noted that it had a dark, vague form, as though someone was standing upright, swaying or moving in the corner of her room, and at some point vanished. After this experience, she never slept alone in that room again, always insisting that she and Chris shared a room, which they did from there on out, though that was not the only incident of its kind. This happened to Katy a number of times, and she detailed that she would be fast asleep, only to wake up to these figures, sometimes in the corner of the room and other times at the foot of the bed. She wouldn't be able to move, and believed that for one reason or another they were just watching her. In addition to these figures, the family also began to witness strange lights in the sky. The description they gave were that they were unlike anything they'd ever seen before, and were like glowing orbs that seemed to appear out of nowhere with a great speed. They noted that the lights would often hover over pastures and near the tree line. They said that they were on the size of a football and had a soft, pulsating glow to them. They appeared in various colours and sometimes would move slowly, which made Jim question as to whether they might have been searching for something or observing something. Reportedly, John was quite disturbed by the presence of these lights, as he just didn't have a great explanation for them, and apparently this actually bothered him quite a lot. One night when he saw them above the nearest pasture, he went out armed and with a flashlight and stood in the field beneath them to try to get a better view of what was going on. As he was making his way through the field, he said that they would zip away and stayed out of reach, as if they didn't want to let him get too near. That was the case at first. After John had tried to reach them and examine them more closely, he said that their behaviour changed somewhat. After this, the lights were no longer confined to the pastures. He, Jim, and others had seen them near the ranch house, just floating outside the windows and illuminating them. They began to wonder if these things were watching the family for some reason. On a number of occasions, Barbara would awaken in the middle of the night and find them just hovering outside her bedroom window before disappearing. This leads us on to the next incident, which I'm going to exclusively refer to the report and let those involved explain what happened in their own words. Jim said, "The forest ranger, David from California, came to visit again. It was late at night, about 2 a.m. Almost all of these incidents have happened at night. We have never seen anything during the daytime. Peggy and Harry were also visiting. 9 discs were in the front yard, and I got a very clear view of them. Harry and Barbara were at the window and David was asleep in the bedroom. I called for David and I started out the front door. I was walking towards them as Barbara and Harry watched from the window." Barbara said, "Harry and I were watching from the window, both from the same window. What I can't figure out is that Jim and I saw a large array of them, but Harry saw large, dark football shapes as if they were blocking part of the view. We were trying to see what would happen in the whole area, and we were watching Jim walk out, which I didn't want him to do. I have no awareness of what happened as far as what anyone else saw from that point on. My face was close to the glass and something hit me in the forehead. It was a forceful impact, like something hit me. I was knocked back off the couch and fell to the floor. Harry saw light out the corner of his eyes, and Jim said he saw a flash of light. I didn't see it. Jim said, Harry yelled to me and I said I saw it. Harry said, it's Barbara, and I went running back to the house and found her in the middle of the floor. Barbara said, the last thing I remember after looking out and seeing them was Jim putting a flashlight in my eyes to see if I had a concussion. Finally, Jim said, while I was working over Barbara on the floor, they disappeared. I thought about it subsequently and wondered why they didn't do it to me since I was the one walking towards them. But then I began to understand that they did the most practical thing that could be done to get me back inside and get both people away from the window. And I think I really began to respect how clever they were. Then I began to suspect that maybe the government was involved. Except that there were a lot of unusual things. For instance, David had been paralysed during the incident. He could hear us calling, but he couldn't get up until it was over. But then he experienced the extremely high-pitched sounds, the humming situation, I assume, and they were continued all night. David was sick then for 3 days. The sound would sometimes give us headaches, but not all of us at once. Barbara was ultimately unharmed, but the family and friends present were left questioning their own sanity, wondering if they'd really just seen and experienced all of that. Subsequently, 2 things happened right after that incident. Jim spoke with a law enforcement officer from the sheriff's office, and he explained to him what they'd witnessed that night. Instead of just calling Jim crazy, this officer actually relayed an odd experience of his own not far from the ranch. He said that while patrolling fairly late, he'd seen a few blinking lights coming from a group of trees. He thought that someone may have been trespassing, but didn't want to investigate alone, thinking that doing so may have been dangerous and could have put him in a bad spot. So instead, he went back to the office and picked up another officer and went back. However, he then said he was deeply confused because when he arrived back, he said that not only were the blinking lights gone, but the trees were gone and he felt like he was going mad. I suppose on that occasion, it was late and would have been fairly dark. Perhaps he'd just mistaken the area he was actually in, and with the second officer then drove to the wrong location. It's not really clear, but Jim just said that he'd never seen anything like trees just disappearing and such. The second thing that happened soon after that night was that they were approached by a wife of a man who was watching over a large neighbouring ranch for the owners who were away on holiday. This man had some cattle of his own, and since he was friends with the ranch owners, they were kind enough to let him station them on their property. This woman told Barbara that their son had found the carcass of his yearling, which is a young horse I believe. The woman said that her husband had been creeped out by it after examining it and didn't really understand what had happened to it. There wasn't much elaboration, but she also said that her son was also terrified and claiming that he'd seen something very large on the property. She then told Barbara that she tried to brush it off and didn't want to discuss it any further because they had children, and she didn't want to freak them all out. And then she asked whether or not Barbara and her family had seen anything like this. While the report doesn't specifically state it, I assume that Barbara may have told the woman about some of the things that had happened, as this other family made arrangements to move back to Nebraska and did so quite quickly once the ranch owners came back from their holiday. Though that's not clear if that was actually their plan all along. Sometime after this, the family sat down together for dinner, and out the window, Joe noticed a dim light coming from a hill beyond the pasture, as though something was on the ground there. Both Jim and Joe decided to go out and see what it was, so they grabbed a flashlight and headed up the hill. They watched the light float into a nearby thicket at the bottom of the slope on the opposite side to the one that they'd climbed. They descended in the same direction as the light and walked to the edge of the woods, and on the ground they saw what they described as a translucent box emitting a soft buzzing sound. The description given was that it was smooth and completely featureless except for the soft pale glow that it was emitting. As they got closer to it, it began buzzing louder with a higher pitch, and Jim said that the noise became quite unbearable. He sent Joe away back towards the hill as he didn't want to put John's son in any danger, because he essentially made the point that he was fearful of this thing for some reason. But also, people had gotten sick previously from hearing these weird sounds. Joe made it back to the bottom of the slope, just behind the tree line away from Jim, and while looking at him through the trees, 2 men came out of nowhere and approached Jim. According to Joe and Jim, they had no idea where these strangers came from, but they both had slender builds and were about 5.5 feet tall. They were wearing black suits that seemed to shimmer in the dim light, and their eyes seemed oddly large for their heads, was the given description. It's probably best to just let Jim explain this next part in his own words. I quote and paraphrase for brevity. These two men obviously weren't nervous, and as soon as I walked up, they spoke to me by my name and told me how nice of you to come. It was just as though I'd been expected. Down below, possibly 50 to 60 feet from us, was a disc on the ground. It was lightly lit, just light enough to see. I was up there for maybe 5 minutes. They apologised for the inconveniences they had caused us, told us that a more equitable arrangement would be worked out between us, whatever that means. I wanted to ask a lot of questions, but found that I didn't ask anything. There are several things they asked me not to repeat that have no significant meaning at all. They are unrelated to anything. I think maybe they were just checking to see if I would keep my mouth shut. I told them that the things they were doing to the cattle was foolish and was drawing a lot of attention. I complained about the damage to our cars, but they never admitted to being responsible for any of it. The one thing they did mention was the box, and that I did the right thing backing away from it, which I took as an implied threat. Approximately 20 to 30 feet away, a large hairy creature got up and walked towards the box. The box changed tone and he dropped. They said, as you can see, they are quite lethal. They said that they would come back and talk again, but there were no goodbyes. In the immediate aftermath, the incidents at the ranch settled down somewhat, and Jim thought that may have been the more equitable arrangement that the two men had mentioned to him. However, in the days and weeks to follow, the momentary peace, according to Jim, came to an end, and the incidents escalated. Everyone in the home reported seeing black silhouettes moving around at night. Orbs of light began to disturb them again, and most annoyingly, according to John, the humming returned. On one occasion, Joe woke up in the middle of the night to find a dark mass at the foot of his bed. He didn't realise it at first, and thought it was just the darkness of the room, until he realised there was just a spot in his vision that he couldn't see beyond. As soon as he realised what he was looking at, he became frozen with fear and couldn't move. It was tall, and its head was almost touching the ceiling. Its limbs were long and spindly, stretching out beyond the edges of the bed. He said that he didn't know what happened next, but he awoke later drenched in sweat and the thing was gone. That honestly sounds more like a nightmare. I think most people have experienced waking up drenched in sweat like that after a particularly bad dream, though he certainly felt that there was more to it than just a bad dream. Perhaps the most alarming night though came when Katy was present over the weekend towards the end of their time spent at the ranch. It was one of John's son's birthdays, though it wasn't specified whose it was. Katy, her sister and the rest of the boys were hanging out in one of the rooms upstairs playing video games and other such things, while the adults were in the living room playing board games together. At some point, the humming started and the entire house was vibrating before the power cut out. As this was happening, according to Katy, she and the others in the room with her saw an extremely bright light right outside their window. All of a sudden, she said that a mechanical sounding voice came out of every corner of the room. She described that you couldn't really pinpoint exactly where it was emanating from, and rather just sounded like it was coming from everywhere at once, which caused everyone to freak out. Katy claims that the voice said, "You are all in danger, you must leave, do not tell anyone, keep your mouth shut." The adults downstairs rushed up to Katy and the others, grabbed them and essentially just left the house and got in the cars. According to Katy, everyone had heard it and it wasn't confined to their room. Katy's mother, alongside the other adults, told them that they weren't to tell anyone about what had happened that night. The incident was the final straw for the family, and they'd essentially agreed that their mental and emotional well-being had taken a nosedive after everything that had happened, and decided it was time to plan a move. It took them 6 months from that point, but they managed to leave the ranch and buy land elsewhere. That's not exactly where the story ends though, as the ranch maintained a strong grip on Katy's mind. The fear from that night, with its glaring light and robotic voice, had etched itself deeply into her memory. Though she grew up and left the area, the ranch never truly left her mind, pulling her back to her childhood again and again. She was convinced that there was something interesting to be understood at the site. In 2013, now something of an investigator, Katy returned to the ranch, with an appetite to learn more about what might have been happening back then. She said that she was struck by how the ranch had both transformed and remained the same. The land still had a strange, unsettling presence, though she wasn't sure if that was just something of a memory she'd never be able to forget about the place. During her investigation, Katy explored the property thoroughly. taking photographs and notes as she revisited the locations of some of her more weird experiences during her youth. One of her most significant discoveries, according to her, was the faint remains of weird circles on the ground. Though barely visible under layers of vegetation, Katy collected soil samples and mapped the locations of these circles, hoping that further analysis might provide clues to their origin, though I'm not sure if anything ever came of that. In an effort to gather more information, Katy reached out to the current owners of the ranch. They confirmed that while the strange activity had decreased over the years, it had not entirely ceased. Occasional sightings of peculiar lights in the sky and inexplicable noises during the night suggested that the ranch may still have been a focal point for weird incidents for the newer owners. For Katy, one of the most compelling accounts came from Sheila, a woman who had lived near the ranch during the height of the unusual activity from around the time Katy used to stay over at the weekend. Sheila recounted an experience from her younger years that left a deep scar. She and her husband had married straight out of high school and had moved to Rama, Colorado, an isolated area near the ranch, where they owned several acres. One day, while her husband was checking on their cattle, he discovered something that left him stunned. The carcass of a calf that had been slain much in the same way that the Priestleys had complained about over the years. The animal apparently had 4 precise incisions forming a perfect square, with its top layer of skin and fur removed, revealing the muscle beneath. What made this more chilling was that, according to Sheila, the calf had been wandering around and healthy just moments before. Her husband was the one that came across the scene, confused and bewildered, rushed back to get Sheila so that they could discuss what in the world had just happened. When they returned together around 20 minutes later, the carcass, according to Sheila, had been further tampered with. The wounds were now cauterized and organs were now missing, and standing over the scene, they felt it was deliberate, in terms of the precision on display. Even more unsettling was the complete absence of evidence on the ground around the scene and the lack of any tracks other than their own. According to the couple, they never heard or saw anything. The entire event had unfolded in utter silence, no helicopters or other vehicles. Sheila said that she and her husband were left with nothing but questions and didn't know how to proceed from there. Sheila also shared the sentiments of some of the Priestley family in terms of sharing that living near the ranch felt like being under constant observation by something. Strange lights frequently appeared above the property, and she often felt an unsettling presence, as if unseen eyes were somehow watching her. This pervasive sense of being watched became a regular part of her existence, which was something that made her feel uncomfortable, and she didn't like being alone. As Katy went on, she said that she began to notice striking parallels between this ranch and the famous Skinwalker Ranch in Utah. Both sites are known for a wide range of alleged bizarre, weird incidents, such as seeing strange lights, particularly awful and unusual things happening to cattle among other animals, and encounters with entities and other such things. Katy felt that the similarities shouldn't be dismissed, and this led her to consider the possibility that these locations, and potentially others like them, might be interconnected somehow. One idea that Katy came across was that these sites seem to be positioned either on or near land with high magnetic fields. This isn't something I know anything about, and I really couldn't find anything about it online, but apparently some do speculate this may have something to do with these kinds of incidents. Katy said that she discovered a geological map highlighting that these regions are highly magnetized. This was the finding that prompted her to wonder if the strange occurrences at the ranch were intrinsically linked to the land itself rather than anything else. The more Katy read about Skinwalker Ranch, she believed the clearer the connections were between the two sites. Both ranches had long histories of bizarre happenings and had attracted significant attention from both civilian and military investigators. While the military interest was more readily apparent to some degree at Skinwalker Ranch, with Senator Harry Reid and the head of the DIA expressing a desire to know more, and funding having actually entered that place, it's less apparent with Clearview, though there may be something to it. Dr. R. Leo Sprinkle, during his and Dr. John S. Durr's report in 1978, while speaking at the sheriff's office, made this note during a conversation. It's difficult to read, but the best I can, somewhat paraphrased. Bill Warr, undersheriff, wants to talk to someone, has seen ships going into the ground, boxes, unusual things happening to cattle. Nobody will talk. They don't want an investigation or publicity. No stigma. Credentials are important. NORAD Colonel said to forget it and shut up. Air Force Academy has directives to handle these incidents. Katy believes that this is why the place gained the name of Clearview in the first place, because there was allegedly all of these strange happenings right out in the open, and branches of the Air Force didn't want the surrounding towns to know about it, so essentially brushed off law enforcement and told them to forget about it. Now of course, this was just a note taken by Dr. Sprinkle, so as long as you assume good faith by those concerned, that is quite interesting. But there isn't really any way of verifying its validity, as Dr. Sprinkle sadly passed away in 2021. There was also another interesting note taken by Dr. Sprinkle. It reads, Warren blank from Fort Carson visits ranch, felt something wrong, wouldn't go into the woods. Something took over his mind, made him walk towards the woods, released him, he could run back, did this 5 times. So, based on what he's saying, I'm assuming he's saying that a military official from Fort Carson attended the ranch for some reason, and then had this weird experience of his own, feeling odd for one reason or another about heading into the woods, but then feeling compelled to enter a number of times. Again, it's difficult to comment on that, but it's certainly interesting that a note like that was even taken in the first place. Though it is important to say, based on the note, you'd think that he may have been talking directly to this Warren, though it's not completely clear if that was the case, or if this was a second-hand account or what by someone else. In any case, Katy continued talking to people from around the area. She realised that there were similar stories coming from all over the place, the nearby towns and even further out, all sharing unsettlingly consistent details that were congruent with her own experiences. One such account came from a military veteran who lived about 14 miles away from the ranch, in another small town within Elbert County in the 1950s. This man, whose name was never disclosed, recounted a night when he and his family were abruptly awakened by an intense light that flooded their home, as bright as daylight despite the late hour. When they looked outside, they saw a large circular vehicle, I suppose, sitting on their property. He'd seen it fly and recounted to Katy that he didn't understand how because it didn't have any wings and didn't seem to be a rocket. Weirdly, he also said that he'd seen people around the thing itself, though he said that there was something off about them. According to his account, he speculated that he thought these people appeared to be conducting some sort of survey or something like that before re-entering the vehicle, which then took off silently at great speed. As mentioned nearer to the start of this video, there had been a lot of rumours about Clearview Ranch, and one thing the locals talked about were the things happening to cattle. Upon reflection, after the shock of witnessing it, he said that he wondered if these people were responsible for the cattle incidents that had plagued the area. He said that he had no evidence of it, of course, but had just wondered if that was what was going on. He reported the incident to the local sheriff, who documented the details but didn't really have anything to add to the conversation. Though in hindsight, reporting it may not have been the best idea, as the vet said that for some reason, this information leaked from the sheriff's department and he was now just seen as nuts. People didn't want anything to do with him and believed he was suffering from hallucinations and he was ridiculed for it, so he eventually moved on from the area. Katy relayed an interesting incident that Chris had told her about. It was her prom night and Joe, I believe, had gone with her so she wasn't alone at the venue. After the dance, she and Joe, I assume, were driving back to the ranch when they noticed a large shadowy figure moving along the roadside. Initially thinking it was a bear or perhaps a large stray dog, they soon realised it was something else. According to them, the figure walked on 2 legs like a person, but was enveloped in thick tangled fur. Its eyes glowed a vivid red in the darkness, and it was very agile. They said that it followed their car, and while they tried to speed away from it, it was able to keep up the pace with their vehicle for several miles before abruptly veering into the woods and vanishing from their view. When they reached the ranch, both were deeply rattled by the encounter and didn't know if it was trying to catch them or what, and wondered just how it might have gone if it did. Katy was hoping to find some concrete evidence of what was going on at the ranch, but allegedly most of it's been lost, destroyed, or concealed over the years, which is always very convenient and a staple in these kind of ranch stories. There's always a lot to be skeptical about and to take these things with a grain of salt. According to Katy, one particularly frustrating example of this involved a metallic material that allegedly had been retrieved on the ranch during a period of heightened activity. This material, supposedly uncovered by earlier investigators, was described as extraordinarily lightweight yet remarkably strong, with a peculiar, almost organic texture. Samples were reportedly collected and subjected to analysis, but the results were never disclosed. Furthermore, the metal itself subsequently disappeared and no one seemed to know its whereabouts, which again, as said, very convenient and not at all dubious. This incident was not isolated, supposedly. Other critical pieces of evidence, including photographs, audio recordings, and physical samples, had also inexplicably vanished over the years. Or in other words, there is no evidence of anything at all outside of testimony. Let's be honest, if you were living there and all of this was happening, wouldn't you have documented this with some pictures and kept it all safe? Especially if you were wanting to tell others about your experiences. Katy did find reference to one significant incident though, involving 2 interceptor jets that crashed while allegedly pursuing something in the sky, not far from the ranch. This event, referenced in Dr. Sprinkle's files, stands out as one of the few documented cases trying to link the strange happenings at the ranch with a military response. Allegedly, the incident occurred when radar detected something in the vicinity, prompting Buckley Air Force Base to scramble 2 interceptor jets. As the pilots closed in on the target, something happened which isn't clear, forcing both of the pilots to eject. Remarkably, both pilots survived, but the cause of this crash remained unexplained. However, Katy was able to obtain the official investigation report through a Freedom of Information Act request, and although the report was heavily redacted, it revealed some interesting information. The investigation attributed the collision to a misidentification by the instructor pilot, leading him to crash into the student's jet. The report did not specify the identity of the supposed other aircraft. You also might choose to look at this claim through another lens. If there really was something unknown spotted on the radar, why would the Air Force send a student pilot up there to deal with a potential threat? Again, that sounds somewhat dubious to me, although I would point out that the Air Force is not my area at all. This news article referencing the incident cites that the instructor was teaching the student about nighttime landings and mentions absolutely nothing about this elusive third aircraft. That about brings us to the end of this. While incredibly interesting, I feel that some of this is rather dubious, and I'd like to know what your thoughts are, so please do give me some comments of your own down below. I'd just like to take the time to thank you for watching, and a big thank you to the patrons who've been running around on the screen. If you enjoyed this video, please do remember to like and subscribe if you haven't already. If you didn't like it, then feel free to give me a thumbs down. I'm just looking for your honest opinion either way. I hope that you've had a great day, or evening, depending on where you are, and I'll see you in the next one. And remember, be safe guys. Peace.